This is the In Memoriam edition. This morning we have just found out about the death of former Premier Jim Prentice in a plane crash in BC. Usually, of course, the press gallery is a little flippant, little glib, we might say, about Alberta politics. Probably not the time this morning. Instead, we're going to talk about the time that Jim Prentice spent here on the politics scene in Alberta. Some of us had the chance to cover him, some of us didn't. I arrived well after the time of Jim Prentice. Graham, you spent a long time, well, I guess the whole time that Prentice was here talking, you know, covering him. So what insights can you give to his time here in Alberta?
Well, the thing is, he came on the scene, we'd heard he'd be coming to run for the leadership. This is after, of course, Alison Redford had stepped down. And then we had an interim premier, well, a premier who was only here for an interim period, and that was Dave Hancock. And then there was a leadership race. And Jim Prentice was out early, and we had heard that he was interested, and he was a shoo-in for that race. There was 3 people in the race, and it was clear he was going to win it. And he, on paper, he was the golden boy on paper. Like he was going to do it for the Tories, and he came in. He was really, really popular because this is a person who was well respected in Ottawa, former federal MP, minister federally, and everyone seemed to like him and respect him. And he came in here, and basically the entire PC caucus was behind him. He had a plan. He was very strategic. This is somebody who was planning things well in advance. He's a chess player thinking 2 or 3 moves or more. And in a sense, that kind of also tripped him up, basically. This is somebody who wanted to win the next election, obviously, but he wanted to unite the right. He got the floor crossing, which actually backfired from the Wild Rose. He went 1 year early in the election campaign, as opposed to waiting until 2015. So those worked against him, but ultimately he was a really decent person. And I think the PCs thought this was the guy that could do it for them, but it turned out, of course, it didn't work out that way in the 2015 election.
You know, Emma, he came to this milieu of provincial politics from having been a very respected federal cabinet minister. His handling of the Indian Affairs file in particular, I remember when he came and met with the Journal's editorial board when he was the Minister of Indian Affairs. He was one of the few cabinet ministers who was actually willing to speak out and trust himself to do so, standing up to Stephen Harper, who was his prime minister at that time. And I thought he handled that file really well. As environment minister, he actually, imagine the unenviable task of being Stephen Harper's environment minister. Another brief that he handled, I think, with a great deal of aplomb. And so when he came here, I had quite high expectations, not as a conservative myself, but as somebody who admired him when he was in Harper's caucus. He supported same-sex marriage and gay rights and broke with his caucus to do so, to vote with the Liberals of the day to help get same-sex marriage the law of Canada. That was something for which he had a lot of blowback in his constituency, and I'm sure in caucus.
Didn't you call his office about that?
Yeah, that's my anecdote. I called his office anonymously to say as an Albertan how proud I was that he'd done that, and his office staff said, "Ma'am, do you live in the riding?" Because they were taking a lot of grief. So when he came here, I was prepared, as somebody whose job it is to criticize the government, I was prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt. And some of his initial appointments, when he brought in Mike Percy, a very respected former Liberal MLA and economist, to be his chief of staff, I thought, well, that's a brilliant appointment. That bodes well. And then the promise that he had offered, that he would bring renewal to a Conservative Party that had been battered by what had happened with Alison Redford, that he would somehow make up for those 44 years of baggage. He was never able to fulfill that promise.